Hi, I'm Neil.
And I'm John.
And you're listening to World of Telly, the podcast where John and I watch every single TV programme ever made in no particular order. And what are we watching today, John?
We're watching Edge of Darkness.
I've never heard of it. Seriously, before we begin, I think we need to point out that you shouldn't listen to this podcast if you haven't seen Edge of Darkness, the 1985 TV serial, not the 2010 Mel Gibson movie.
Please don't mention that.
If you haven't seen Edge of Darkness, do yourself a favour and go and watch it and then come back. You can buy it on Amazon Prime for £4 for the whole series in HD.
I mean, that's incredible.
That's the best £4 you're ever going to spend.
Absolutely.
So, assuming that you know what Edge of Darkness is now, we can start the podcast. So, if we're going to talk about the story of Edge of Darkness, John, we need to start with the story of Troy Kennedy Martin.
Yes.
Now, you're a bit of an expert on Troy Kennedy Martin, I believe.
I wouldn't say an expert, but yeah, he looms large for a number of reasons in the history of TV drama and indeed some cinema history as well. As well as writing some single plays, he was largely the creator of Z-Cars in 1962, along with the producer and director John McGrath. And he was quite a radical young man and young writer. And after only a short time with Z-Cars, he fell out with people because he didn't like the direction that the show was going in. It wasn't radical enough for him. So he stopped writing for it. And there seems to be a bit of a history of that with the Kennedy Martin brothers, because his brother Ian, who created the Sweeney, left very early on in the Sweeney history. And ironically, Troy Kennedy Martin went on to write quite a few episodes, which I'm sure put a bit of strain on the relationship at the time.
And the feature film version as well, or one of them.
He did the Sweeney 2, I think.
Yeah.
He did. But then after he left Z-Cars, he was famous within the industry for a couple of things, because he wrote an article called Nats Go Home, first statement of a new drama for television, which was in the theatre magazine Encore in 1964. And in that, effectively, it's a complicated article to summarise, but effectively he was rebelling against the kind of talky stage drama that was kind of very heavily based on theatre that was in TV. He sort of summarised it as, somebody says something, you film somebody else reacting to somebody saying something. And he argued for a much more visual, a much more radical form of non-naturalism, as he called it. Now, this was very influential with people like Ken Loach and Dennis Potter, and sort of went on to form a lot of the look of the then just about to emerge Wednesday play. Which, of course, again, with some of the plays in the Wednesday play, Up the Junction, for example, and Cathy Come Home, they weren't exactly following Troy Kennedy Martin's manifesto as such, but all of those people who are at TV Centre and elsewhere making TV drama knew about that article. The whole of the next issue of Encore was full of articles, some enraged articles from writers, arguing and debating with Kennedy Martin. So he was a theorist as well as a practitioner. Then he got into the film world, and most famously, he wrote The Italian Job, one of the most successful and well-loved British films of all time.
Kelly's Heroes?
Indeed, Kelly's Heroes, which wasn't an unalloyed joy, I don't think, in terms of he got to see exactly what Hollywood did, because the script was quite softened. I believe Clint Eastwood loved the original script, but was quite disillusioned by the end of the film because of the fact that it had been changed. And then after a few more sort of misfires in Hollywood, he then came back, wrote for the Sweeney.
Yeah, didn't he come back and write the last episode of Z-Cars as well?
He did, which is a very strange affair.
Oh, yeah.
Basically, it features a lot of the actors, like Brian Blessed, famous for being in Z-Cars, but none of them play the characters that they were in Z-Cars.
You're kidding?
No, I'm not kidding. So Brian Blessed's playing one kind of character, and it's just not playing Fancy Smith, his original character. It's very...
Wow.
Again, it's very stylised, it's non-naturalistic, and by this time, John McGrath, who was one of the great driving forces with Z-Cars in the beginning, had gone off to have a very radical career in theatre. And so he came back to do Z-Cars, and instead of doing what you might do with a typical last episode of a programme that's been running for 16 years, they did this sort of kind of nod and a wink and very, very odd kind of approach to it. So a lot of people didn't like that, but there it is. Then he went on to do some work for the BBC with an adaptation of Angus Wilson's novel The Old Men at the Zoo, which is a kind of dystopian vision, and that's getting into a kind of political parody of fascism, which again is something that I think, kind of filters in and feeds into a lot of the kind of drama that was being made in that point in the 80s. And for Euston Films, he made a very long and kind of epically expensive series called Riley Ace of Spies with Sam Neill in it. And that sort of brings us up to Edge of Darkness, a whistle-stop tour.
So in like 1983, 1984, he starts work on it, and I believe he didn't have any indication it was going to be commissioned. He just did it to get it out of his system, I think he said.
Exactly that, yeah.
Because the BBC weren't making any political dramas, basically.
Well, yeah, I mean, when he started writing it, I guess, but of course, it's slightly offset by the fact that around this time, the Boys from the Black stuff had just been on. The History Man, coincidentally, we should mention Michael Waring, the producer, who was responsible for these. There was something called Bird of Prey, another paranoid kind of conspiracy political drama. So he started writing it, even if he didn't think there was an obvious commission for it at the BBC. It just so happened to coincide with a massive sweep upwards in the quality and the nature of drama series that were being made at the BBC at that time.
Yeah, and this is around the time, isn't it, that the emphasis is changing from single play drama to the serial.
Yes, absolutely. The Play for Today effectively died in 1984.
It was the year before.
Yeah, 1984.
Came back now and again, didn't it? But it wasn't a regular thing.
Yeah, I mean, it came back under different guises, but obviously the big influence at that time, the change to the system was also that instead of doing, if you were doing one-offs, one-off dramas, they were doing it as films, and that's largely because of the influence of Film 4 and the creation of Channel 4, which of course started in November 1982.
I believe when he started writing it, it was going to be about the miners' strike. And in fact, you can still see elements of that in the script we finally got.
The first episode starts with the main character is a policeman who's being asked not to investigate the union because there's some alleged voting inconsistencies, voting irregularities with the unions. Really interesting way that Kennedy Martin wrote things and approached things, and not really like a lot of other dramatists. And so he works his way through. He might have been going in at one angle, but he never truly gets rid of all of the elements that were going to be much more kind of the main part of the programme before.
Yeah, so he started with the miners. He couldn't get that to work. And I think the catalyst is the famous speech by Ronald Reagan in 1983, the so-called Star Wars speech. That seemed to be the sort of catalyst to get him to start writing about the nuclear state.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was really in the air as well, wasn't it, around that time? I mean, just before Edge of Darkness, you've got Threads. You've got the American version the day after. I think in the same year, they aired The War Game, which was the 1960s dramatisation of a nuclear holocaust, which wasn't shown for 20 years. In America, you've got films like Silkwood, and also the famous case of Hilda Murrell.
Yes, absolutely. She kind of died in mysterious circumstances.
There was something in the air, wasn't there, in the early 80s? This nuclear conspiracy and paranoia.
There definitely was, and it was also the fact, again, I suppose it ties in with the BBC being more willing to do these kind of political drama. Now, obviously, there'd always been political stream of drama, particularly through Wednesday Play and Play for Today. It's the change into the serials, I think, is the significant change around this time. It also opening up more to things like nuclear weaponry and nuclear energy as being a main theme, because as you say, Threads, I think it was when Threads was repeated, there was a season and they put on the War Games. I think it was alongside, it was like consecutive days or something like that. And the War Game had been this cause célèbre where Hugh Carlton Green, the then Director General of the BBC in the 60s, in the end, basically under government pressure, as has been documented comparatively recently, it was the government effectively that told Hugh Green not to transmit it. And I remember going to see the War Game in a screening at the Methodist Church in Long Eaton, because it used to tour the country like on a 16mm film, so people could go and see, and obviously CND would organise it. And Peter Watkin, who got an Oscar for it, I believe, Peter Watkin, the director, he was very happy for it to be circulated. So that's the way it had gone around the country, and suddenly there it was front and centre on the BBC. So things were sort of changing, and it as you say, it was very much in the zeitgeist.
So this change from single plays to the serial, it's more like a novel for television rather than a play for television, isn't it? That's the sort of influence. And you've got programs like Brideshead Revisited before this, Jewel and the Crown, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, but they're all based on existing novels, whereas Edge of Darkness was written specifically for the television. I think that's what sets it apart.
Yeah, I think it does set it apart, but it's interesting that, again, going back to this thing about realism, naturalism, and so on, Troy Kennedy Martin was not a man of the theatre. First thing he wrote, I think, was a novel. And he saw the serial, as you say, as like the 19th century novel. Room to breathe, lots of characters, and for the action to develop and for the themes to develop over a period of time. I think for the BBC, the really significant bit was Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, definitely.
That was produced by Jonathan Powell, who's going to come into this story in a moment. I mean, Doctor Who fans will know about Jonathan Powell. Didn't he famously say, when talking about John Nathan Turner, he wished he'd fuck off or die?
Yes, that's right. Producer of Doctor Who, John Nathan Turner. He just wished he'd fuck off and die. Yes, that's interesting. And I've had fruitless conversations sometimes, I think, with Doctor Who fans. Not that we want to get sidetracked by that. Just because Jonathan Powell didn't like your program doesn't mean that Jonathan Powell was worthless in the history of broadcasting. You can argue about how good of a head of department he was and all of those things, but as a producer, as a commissioner, he's got a lot of good stuff to back him up.
Yeah, Jonathan Powell became head of BBC drama serials on the back of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Smiley's People, which are both conspiracy-driven dramas. So you can see how Edge of Darkness would fit with Jonathan Powell's sensibilities. And one of the first things he did was he brought Michael Waring, the producer of Boys from the Black Stuff in Birmingham, back down to London to produce it.
Birmingham, Pebble Mill drama, basically, that came out of Pebble Mill is really one of the great stories of TV of that era, particularly the hugely influential figure of David Rose, who sort of relished being out of London on the premise that, you know, there was no one looking over his shoulder, so he could pretty much do what he liked. Some astonishing material came out of the drama department at Pebble Mill. You've got Gangsters, obviously, and then, of course, David Rose got poached effectively and went over to Channel 4, and he was the one who started up Film 4. So again, a hugely influential figure. And I love the story of when they used to get a certain number of Play for Todays each year, a certain quota. And he went to Television Centre one day and he came back out and he went to the cinema, which is the Shepherd's Bush Empire. And he was halfway through the French Connection. And he was watching the French Connection and he just had these meetings about Play for Todays. And he thought, why can't he obviously thought it was great, tremendously exciting, hugely dramatic. And he said, why can't we have a Play for Today that's like this, that's like an intelligent piece of work, but is kind of visceral and thrilling and all of those things? And that's pretty much what led to Gangsters. And it was a real revolutionary thing. And as you say, Michael Waring came out of that brew, and as did things like Artemis 8-1 and Penda's Fen, all of these incredible kind of pieces of work that are all sort of BBC Birmingham, Pebble Mill.
I guess the next person we should talk about is the director, Martin Campbell. Now, didn't Martin Campbell direct Eskimo Nell?
He did, as has sometimes been described rather lazily as a Citizen Kane of British sex films, with Katie Manning amongst other people on there. It's basically a satire on sexploitation films. Not that I've seen it, obviously.
He made several, though, didn't he?
Yeah.
He made at least 2 or 3.
Yes, he did. I mean, if you were trying to make your way in the British film industry, there was basically very little British film industry at the time, which is why you get that incredible era of lots of sex films of varying degrees of explicitness, but with people like Captain Peacock from Are You Being Served suddenly cropping up, or, you know, Bernie Winters suddenly appearing next to Mary Millington and all this kind of stuff. So it was a pretty bleak era in all sorts of ways, but that's where Martin Campbell started out.
Didn't he end up directing things like The Professionals and Minder and all those classics?
Yeah, and again, the great sudden blossoming of the independent studios, the affiliated studios like Euston, which worked solely on film and shot entirely differently to the way that Thames, which was its parent company, would film. So they were working with the same crew for every episode, things like that, rather than having whoever was allocated on the roster in Thames Teddington Lock Studios. And there was just a feeling that people were actually being able to be much more creative.
We've mentioned Martin Campbell, we've mentioned Michael Waring, and obviously we've mentioned Troy Kennedy Martin. And then the fourth part of this jigsaw puzzle is the actor Bob Peck. Bob Peck hadn't done much TV, had he?
No, he'd done very little. He'd done Bird of Prey 2, which, again, Bird of Prey is by Ron Hutchinson. It's a paranoid conspiracy thriller. Richard Griffiths plays a mild-mannered office worker who basically accidentally uncovers a conspiracy and lots of people die. It's 4 episodes, and the second series has got Bob Peck in it. He dies quite ignominiously in it, actually. It's not a huge role.
So Bob Peck was mainly known for his theatre work, wasn't he? He was at the Royal Shakespeare Company when Ian McKellen and Judi Dench were there.
Absolutely, he was he was famous for. I mean, I know my partner saw him as Caliban in The Tempest.
Wow!
And he was she couldn't understand a word he said because he's got, as we'll no doubt come on to, he's got this nasal voice, nasal Yorkshire voice, and he was doing the ban Caliban, and she just couldn't understand what the hell was going on. And he also played Macbeth. But that production had a couple of puppeteers above the stage, high in the sort of rafters, in a rather heavy-handed kind of. They're all puppets of fate and things like that. But he was very, very admired by other actors. I think it's safe to say that.
It's quite surprising, I think, when you find out he was such a theatre actor, because the acting he performs in Edge of Darkness, it's all in the eyes, whereas on stage that wouldn't work. So do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean, because I can't think of a performance that's so in the face and the eyes that there is. I mean, I think he was quite good at the physical side of things on stage. And I think there's a quote from him, isn't there, where he was interviewed, where he said the fact that he wasn't that famous an actor probably meant that the directors and the producers thought he was more malleable, because he was so keen to get the job and so happy to get it that they put him through a lot. So they like soaked him to the skin with terrible rainfall. They made him sprint along numerous corridors, gassed him in various places. So I think so it's both incredibly physical performance, but also those moments of quiet, those moments of just kind of despair, and the kind of expression is just you know, it's hands down one of the greatest performances in all TV drama, I think.
And he's in almost every scene, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. That's
incredible.
And that goes back to what he was saying. They worked me very hard, because he's basically like, he has no chance to rest throughout the whole making of it. One thing I also have to mention as well is that, you know, that's a slightly more glib point. He wears a fantastic collection of jackets and coats. I think we should never lose sight of that. He's just like, even though he's had a trip down to London, he just seems to have a different one, or, you know, for every occasion. It's quite something.
He's the poster boy for Man at CNA.
He is. That's exactly what he is. And what's wrong with that?
Room 7016.
Craven, my name is Jedberg.
Who did you say you are?
Darius Jedberg. I'm a friend of Harcourt's.
I am not a friend of Harcourt's. I only met him today and I don't like him already.
So we've talked a little bit about the background to Edge of Darkness, and now we're going to get into the specifics of the plot. So this is your last chance. If you haven't seen Edge of Darkness, we're going into spoiler territory. I strongly suggest you go and watch it. Now, John, how was Edge of Darkness received by the critics when it first came out?
In terms of reaction, it's interesting, because the press, very unusually, I think, it got reviewed throughout the run. Quite often in those days, you get the beginning and possibly the end. This time it seems to be kind of coming up, and it kind of builds this momentum. But there are quite a few criticisms. Interestingly, Hugh Hebert from The Guardian, who was very single play, I think that's part of the issue. He was a very single play kind of guy, big expert on David Mercer, the playwright, and so on and so forth. He was very critical, because he thought the first episode, and I find it kind of hard to believe, he says, we've seen it all before. It's all a cliche. And why did, you know, it's the policeman, he's had a bereavement. Why do we have to see so many shots of him wandering around his house staring at things? And it's just interesting that somebody can characterize it, because, I mean, the opening episode is so kind of beyond gripping. And the acting from Bob Peck, it's just like, but I suppose the thing not to lose sight of is, Troy Kennedy Martin was one of the people who created Z-Cars. And Z-Cars was like, you know, a big break from, though I dispute this slightly, it was a big break from some aspects of Dixon of Dock Green. Mm-hmm. It was supposed to have led to a greater realism in terms of how the police were portrayed. But it's a police procedural. And at the start, so is Edge of Darkness. But that, to me, is what is very interesting about what Troy Kennedy Martin is doing. He's taking something that he was at the forefront of, but then he's taking it in such a different direction. Mm-hmm. He's taking it into the political conspiracy thriller, but then he's not afraid to just dispense of bits as he goes along, because, you know, it's quite interesting that the police investigation element just melts away at the end of episode 4. There's just never, some of the characters just don't even come back into it again.
Yeah, by the end of episode 4, you know everything there is to know about people's motivations and what the general plot is. There isn't some big revelatory twist at the end, which is quite unusual for a 6-part drama. The last 2 episodes is just following things as they reach their conclusion in a really horrible way.
Yes, and it is a really horrible way. I think he wrote the last 2 first, didn't he? Or the 4th and 5th. Yeah, he originally, when he got commissioned, he had 2 episodes. One of them at least was set in the actual nuclear reactor.
Right.
And he had to then work out how they got there. And then he had notes, very light descriptions of the rest of it. And that's why I think it's got this quite unusual shape. and it's got callbacks in it that maybe are callbacks to things that were intended at one point to be much bigger elements of it, like the mining thing we were discussing. One of the other things I like about it is, while it's got a framework that's not that unusual, it goes in directions you just do not expect it to go in. And there are several of those where it gets into that non-naturalistic territory.
I think what's interesting about that first episode particularly is it's really grounded in reality. There's a real MP. Is it Michael Meacher? He appears in the first episode. Sue Cook is playing herself as a TV presenter. You got Margaret Thatcher on the TV. So everything's very grounded in reality.
Yeah.
And then slowly it sort of becomes... I mean, one of the things we must talk about, and the thing that a lot of people mention when they talk about Edge of Darkness, is the fact that one of the characters is, theoretically, a ghost. Or is she a ghost? I don't actually buy that. What do you think?
Yeah, just to say, the story is that Craven's daughter, Emma, Craven is a reasonably high-ranking policeman. He picks her up from university. She's a political student, and she's a member of an organisation called Gaia, which you find out later as things progress. It's an environmental pressure group. And she gets shot, and everybody assumes that it was kind of a mistake, and it was going to Craven. Somebody Craven has made an enemy of over the years.
So far, so ordinary.
So far, so ordinary. But then very quickly, he meets with some high up government officials, particularly Harcourt and Pendleton, who basically say to him, oh, your daughter was some kind of terrorist. But then you also have something quite interesting about what Craven knew and what he didn't know.
Well, that's the thing. That's the big shock. When the first time I saw it, I remember being very shocked. I assumed when I first saw it is that he didn't know anything about this and he was completely unawares. But it turns out he's quite complicit.
Yes, and apparently Troy Kennedy Martin and the director and the producer had big arguments about this. They did. They really big arguments about what did Craven know and how was this going to be rolled out. But basically, the thing you were alluding to before is that, by the way, both beginning and final episode have Craven go into a sports place of some kind and emptying out someone's locker.
What a nice bookend.
It never occurred to me before that actually happens in it. But basically, he goes and gets Emma's gym stuff and is washing it, and you hear Emma speaking to him to tell him how to do the washing, and it's a voiceover. But then later on when he's driving down, you hear the voice of young Emma. He's driving down to London, you hear the voice of young Emma, and you see her in shot with him. And apparently Martin Campbell just made that decision. They were never supposed to be in the same shot, and it was meant to maintain the illusion that it was all in Craven's head. Troy Kennedy Martin was asked by Martin Campbell, is that okay? And he just said, yeah, that's fine.
Anne Soamstad says the Queen isn't a friend of the miners.
Anne Soamstad is a communist.
What's a communist?
Someone who doesn't like the Queen.
Anne Soamstad says the Queen is a waste of money.
What's money got to do with it? Money doesn't come into it. You would still be dead and so would Mum.
Don't cry, Dad.
One of the things I love about that is one route of doing things is just suddenly on the spur of the moment is abandoned. But what do you mean, Neil, when you say she's not a ghost?
I don't think she's a ghost. I think she's just a figment of his imagination. It's just a manifestation of his grief. And I don't think he believes that she's a ghost.
No, I don't either.
Because he says to Jedburgh at one point, we're getting ahead of ourselves slightly, but Jedburgh sort of talks about the supernatural element to all of this. And Bob Peck's character, Craven, does not believe him. Now, if he was seeing a ghost, then he would believe him. So I think it was intended for her to just be in his head. And I think that's the way I read it.
Towards the end, I think Craven starts to change his mind about some aspects of it, particularly where Emma was shot and died. A spring spontaneously appears in his garden, and you can tell it puzzles him. But whether that's a supernatural thing rather than Gaia and the planet doing these things.
There's lots of room, isn't there, for interpretation. You can read it whichever way you want. But for me, she's not a ghost.
I agree. I totally agree. It's in his mind. I don't think it rules out it being in his mind just because you see them both together and interacting.
And again, it's an incredible performance by Joanne Whalley. She was also in Riley House of Spies, directed by Martin Campbell. That's where I assume that Martin knew her from. And that's why he cast her, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and she is astonishingly good in it. And then she went on to be in The Singing Detective. So, not bad on your CV, is it, really?
What the hell were you up to? What the hell do you think you were doing?
I knew what I was doing.
Did you? Like hell you did.
Yes, I did.
You took on some of the toughest men in the most dangerous business on this earth. God knows what they had down there.
We nearly made it.
They were just waiting for you, didn't stand a chance.
Somebody else we haven't spoken about yet, and another big actor in this piece is Colonel Jedburgh, played by Joe Don Baker.
Mitchell.
He's in it because they got American funding.
Yeah, I think it was Lionheart, wasn't it?
That's right, because the budget wouldn't have stretched to make this just on a normal BBC budget. I think Michael Waring famously said something like, it's the budget of Bergerac plus 10%. The extra 10% came from the Americans. I think the only note they gave the production team was that Jedburgh had to appear in the first episode. I think that was it, the only stipulation.
Yeah, he's inserted. When you know that, it's quite obvious. But, apparently they were the perfect kind of co-producers because that was literally it. And they didn't interfere. And the other thing that's interesting about Edge of Darkness is that they set it to quite it's quite a generous amount of filming time, but it was set about a year ahead and they had to do it then. And of course, there was no sign of any properly done scripts at that point. So that's another interesting bit that, they committed to everything. And they were still arguing about bits of it while they were filming it, which for something with that kind of budget or that kind of scale now, it just feels incredibly hard to believe that would happen in that way now. And so Troy Kennedy Martin was really under the clock to get it complete and agreed by the time that they had the commitment in stone to start filming. So again, I think that sometimes might be the reason for why some of it, there's some interesting little kind of quirks in there where you can either look at them as inconsistencies or something that actually makes it a richer kind of experience.
Your friends are stationed in London?
No, sir. Colonel Kelly here is from Dallas. You ever been to Dallas, Craven?
No, sir.
It's where we shoot our presidents. Jews got their cavalry, but we got Dealey Plaza.
Joe Don Baker as Darius Jedburgh is absolutely fantastic. I mean, he gets the lion's share of the humour, but they are really good lines, funny. They're proper funny. That's the other thing that people shouldn't lose track of if they're going to watch Edge of Darkness again and remember it as being quite a gloomy thing. It's absolutely not. It's got some real zingers in it and some very memorable characters, most of which have got a kind of massive element of humour in them.
And the relationship between Craven and Jedburgh, it's chalk and cheese, isn't it? You couldn't get two more separate characters, but the interplay between them is incredible, especially in episode 5.
Yeah, and it's great because the bit that made me laugh when I watched it again, I mean, I've watched it many times, but I haven't watched it for a while, was when they're getting ready to go into Northmoor, the nuclear plant, and they're getting into the van. They're sort of laughing and joking. You don't hear the dialogue at that point, but it's like they're going on like a Ramblers Club day out or something. And for the fact that Bob Peck's famously kind of got that hawkish visage, that kind of heavy brow and the kind of like, the bleak kind of expression, he does more smiling than I remember, and that bit in particular is hilarious. They're just sort of like they're having a great time,
even though they know they're going to walk into a nuclear accident.
Yeah, exactly.
Another thing we should talk about, keeping with the supernatural theme, is the original ending to Edge of Darkness, where I believe that the original plan was that Craven was going to turn into a tree.
Yes. Again, this goes back to what I was saying. Script changes, but they don't change all of it. So there are these references in at least a couple of episodes. Emma says to him at one point when he's about to break down, you've got to be strong like a tree, which is obviously would have developed more. It kind of would have been resolved in a way if the ending had turned out like it was going to. There's also when he has the full breakdown and is in the mental hospital, he's constantly doodling trees. And in fact, the reason that he doesn't take the stand against Northmoor in the parliamentary inquiry is because the baddies, as it were, have got hold of his medical report. And as Harcourt says, if you've got an arboreal passion that would look very peculiar if they decided to kind of twist it that way. So that is, yeah.
It's all leading up to him turning into a tree, basically.
Exactly. But I like the fact that Michael Waring's quite tactful about it. His view is that he was happy with it if it was realisable, but apparently Bob Peck was absolutely dead against it.
The apocryphal story, I think, is that he says, there's no way I'm turning into a fucking tree.
But then when he was interviewed, I think, by Paul Venezis for the sort of 1987, 88 or something like that, I think it would have been, he basically said, well, Troy always blames me for this. I just think it would have just looked terrible.
It wouldn't have worked.
And it would have been a kind of move into a fantastical realm that though the program is full of things like that, I think having someone turn into a tree would have just looked kind of not very good. It probably looked a bit Doctor Who-y, actually, wouldn't it? Thinking about it.
Mark of the Rani. That's where they got the idea from. I believe the critics' reaction to that last episode was quite lukewarm.
I think the critics' reaction to the last 2 episodes was quite lukewarm. One of the great ironies of it is that more than one of the reviews said that episode 5 was kind of sub-James Bondian action. The great irony, of course, being that Martin Campbell went on to direct 2 Bond films, GoldenEye and Casino Royale. You know, maybe it was because I was young. I wasn't that young. I was about, I don't know, I was 16, something like that, getting on for 16. I just thought it was, you know, head and shoulders above any kind of action I'd seen in anything. And to me, what an amazing series where you've got all this dark, brooding, you know, intense, but with lots of humour in there as well. And then suddenly you've got this kind of like, you know, Travis out of Blake 7, Brian Croucher.
Machine gun fire going off everywhere.
Machine gun fire everywhere. You know, you got
that siren that's going off constantly.
Brilliantly. And Darius Shepard going in there and putting loads of stuff in a Harrods carrier bag, putting loads of plutonium in a...
He's like Ned Beatty in The Big Bus.
Yeah.
Doing it here? Yeah! That's where they keep the plutonium. Quick! Go outside and hold them off! They'll be here in a minute! I'm staying here! What for? Look, I don't need you in here, I need you out there! How long do you need? For as long as it takes!
I think a lot of critics thought that how on earth did they get out when it came to the next episode. But again, this is when you're in a... may have started off looking like it's one kind of program, but it's actually another kind of program. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's anything in there that doesn't really work. I mean, it's just the case that
well, there's one thing that bothers me and always has bothered me, and that's the sort of running theme of incest. Am I reading too much into it, John, or is there an incest theme in this program?
Well, you know, it's important. There is an incest theme, but I think it's overplayed somewhat. I mean, it's hard to say. I don't think we're meant to think that Craven and Emma are literally in an incestuous relationship.
No.
I don't think the famous bit where he's desolate after she's been killed and he finds her vibrator and kisses it tenderly. It's an amazing scene, and I think it's problematic in some ways, but I don't see that as being, you know, anything other than an in the moment kind of moment of tenderness.
I agree if that was the only thing, but it's not, is it?
No. Well, there's the reference to the young Emma saying, "I think you better sleep with me tonight, Daddy."
She calls him jealous when he complains about her boyfriend.
Yes, and then there's when he goes to the Barbican with Clemmy. The play they go to see is about incest. But I have again with Troy Kennedy. I think it's open. I think it puts too much of a slant of a very weird slant on it in terms of our sympathies towards the protagonist. If that's followed through, I think it's references. It's a bit like the tree references. May have been at one point they were intending to go one way with it or not, but then actually they've sort of pulled away from it. And I don't. It's a problematic area. I think though that scene where if it was just that scene with the vibrator, that certainly adds something to that scene. But no, it's an odd one. I don't know whether the same choice. I try not to think about the film version, but I presume it's not in there.
Have you got them?
Good. What?
The tickets. The ones Beric gave you.
What's it about?
Incest.
The last episode in particular is one of the grimmest 55 minutes of TV I think I've ever seen. The fact that the bad guys and the good guys sort of have dinner together. You know, Hardcore learns that he's been manipulated into uncovering this conspiracy, whereas they knew all along what was going on. But his reaction to it is just, yeah, okay, fair enough. Is there anything more bleak than that?
Yeah, I mean, he gets certainly angry with the minister, doesn't he, at that point? But no, as you say, I think ultimately they are incredibly cynical people who, and in the end, it's that kind of, there's that brilliant line right at the end in the voiceover where Harcourt says, "I saw Craven on the hillside. I didn't think it appropriate to wave."
They're a bunch of arseholes.
Oh, they are. They're terrible, terrible people. And I think it's good to have that scene because basically, though it's stretching credibility, the fact that Grogan is there having that dinner with them, despite the fact he's been irradiated, and then the next day you find out he's looking really ill. You'd think maybe he might go to hospital after that rather than say gentleman to evil over dinner, basically, which is what they're doing. But I think there's no doubt that in the end, despite the fact that they've been looking daggers at Bennett and Grogan across the Houses of Parliament for the previous load of episodes, that it's just the establishment, isn't it? They'll just dine together, and in the end, it's all just a game.
You asked about Craven. Oh, last we saw of him was up on the hill overlooking the loch, staring down at us like a wild animal. Neither myself nor Pendleton felt it appropriate to wave. Besides, by my reckoning, he was not long for this world.
If Jerome Wally's character isn't a ghost, I think what's interesting about that last episode is our two main characters are essentially ghosts. They're both dead men walking. And there's just the fact that they get more and more ill and sick is... I mean, Bob Peck's performance of a dying man, it's just incredible. It
is. And there's some really very convincing vomiting. And Craven wanted to go into the hot cell, the nuclear accident, didn't he? He says to I want to go in there.
It's suicide. It literally is suicide.
Yeah, basically it is, isn't it? That's because he can't, he's had a world of grief. His wife died young. His daughter's been killed and he doesn't really want to go on. It's almost like Craven's happy that they might be tracing the call and coming to get him.
And there's that great scene at the end where they decide not to kill him and they say, we're not going to kill your son because you're on our side. And he screams at them, I'm not on your side. And that's like the point where he becomes, completely on the same side as Emma at that point, I think.
Do it!
No, old son. You're on our side.
I am not on your side!
And there's a hopeful ending in the sense that the planet is going to kick our ass. So,
but then that's the great thing about it. When Craven is now believing that will happen, the planet will be. And it was interesting watching it because my partner thought that the black flowers were mentioned throughout, but actually they're only mentioned for the first time in the last episode. So again, I think that's part of because they didn't know how to end it. There wasn't the way of seeding it throughout, no pun intended. So again, that's interesting that's the way that came in because they were struggling over what to do with the ending. But the fact is, it's a deeply kind of like ambivalent one, isn't it? Because if the planet does survive, then it's going to take tens of hundreds of thousands of years to do it, and everybody will be long dead anyway. But also, you get that wonderful bit where he's explaining this to Jedburgh, and Jedburgh talks about the Afghans eating the flowers in Afghanistan.
Yeah. And one thing we haven't mentioned is the music.
At the time, it was like a fantastic strength to it because it really made it stand out as something distinctive. And obviously Eric Clapton did the music with Michael Kamen. Hadn't done a TV programme before. I'm not sure whether he'd done much in the way of film soundtracks either. So it was one of the things that added a real kind of prestige to it. But I suppose one thing about it now is it places it in the time quite a bit, doesn't it?
It really does, because the orchestration is done on a synthesizer and the drum machine in particular is so mid-80s. It really dates it, which is a shame because the actual motif that plays throughout the series is just so iconic.
Yeah.
The best version to listen to is the live version that Eric Clapton does with the Philharmonic Orchestra, because it's got real orchestra, real drums, and it sounds fantastic. I think he won the BAFTA for that, didn't he?
Yeah, it's very high in the mix as well, I think, at times. I think it's a little bit intrusive at times, but I think that was the style they were going for. But it certainly, it just does place it a bit in its time. I mean, but speaking of BAFTAs, I mean, it won a lot, didn't it, basically?
I think it was nominated for 11 and won 6.
But it got the biggies, didn't it? Yeah, the big ones.
Yeah, it got the main ones. I think the only one that really surprised me was Joe Don Baker didn't get Best Supporting Actor, which is a shame.
No, I can't remember who did it at that time. But no, it is a shame. And I know that I've struggled to find it, but I once saw him being interviewed on TV not long after he'd made it and it had been received so well. And he basically, he was almost getting tearful about it because he just said he'd never had an experience working on anything else like that.
Not even Mitchell.
I think it's because he was in something called, what was it called? It had 2 different names. It was Chief of Detectives, I think it was called over here. He was in a TV show, which was a bog standard police procedural where he was the main character. And that would have been like, 30 episodes a year on the kind of like the treadmill. Then he did Edge of Darkness, and it was like Martin Campbell was saying, what do you think, Joe? Do you want to try it and he was just like flabbergasted. He almost fainted because they were saying, try it in a different way, do it like this. So I know he had a brilliant time on it.
And of course, he ended up in James Bond as well with Martin Campbell.
Absolutely.
So he sort of had a second life, really, didn't he? Through this program. Now, not only did it win loads of BAFTAs, but there's also a strange story around the broadcast of the program, in the sense it got a really quick repeat.
Yeah, and it's a measure of how, one way or another, it was received, and the kind of vibe, and everybody seemed to be talking about Edge of Darkness, and it just sort of obliterated most of the other stuff that was around. I mean, on BBC Two, it was originally shown on BBC Two in sort of November to December 1985, Monday nights about 9:30, I think, and it got about 4 million average. And now that for a drama on BBC Two was actually pretty good, but it generally meant it was about 5th or 6th in the BBC Two top 10. And very early on, as you say, Michael Grade made the decision to repeat it in December of the same year.
And they were on consecutive nights, weren't they?
3 consecutive nights, double episodes. And that got, I don't know, something like 8 or 9 million, something like that as well. It was pretty unprecedented to do something like that in that manner. It just kind of spoke to the fact that it was seen as being something very much out of the ordinary. And as I say, it got reviewed kind of fairly constantly. And it was almost like the TV critics couldn't stop talking about it. It was like even if they were starting to get a bit disenchanted with it or thought it had gone off a bit after showing such promise, they still wanted to talk about it.
So, John, I think we can both agree that Edge of Darkness is a fantastic piece of television. Could you narrow down a specific scene or moment that you think encapsulates why you think this is such a great programme?
I think there's so many great scenes. I mean, particularly some of the scenes between Jedburgh and Craven. But weirdly, I think one of my favourite scenes, probably the favourite scene, is at the beginning when Craven goes to pick up Emma from the university and drives her back, and they have a conversation in the car. And he makes some kind of like typically daddish comment about when Emma moves out, he'll set himself up with some little number, and he was getting distracted by her comrades at the thing. And she says, "You're always talking about sex now, Dad." And he says, "What's wrong with that?" And she says, "Because there are other things." And it's a great line, particularly in the context of what's going to happen. But I always think about it in terms of the Sing Detective following the next year, because, of course, that's all about sex. Completely. So it's one of these things where Edge of Darkness is about the more. And Sing Detective, which kind of came later, is back about sex again. But it's just a great line. But it's also a moment you see them together before all the horror happens. And it's a great scene to start with. So what about you, Neil? What's your favourite scene?
I think the moment for me that distills Edge of Darkness, I mean, it's quite a cliched scene in a way. It's the bit where, right at the beginning of episode 4, I think it is, Craven is confronted by the man who killed Emma, a guy called Macroon, who was, I believe, in the IRA.
Yeah.
And they're standing in the living room, and Macroon's got a shotgun levelled at Craven. And Craven is desperate to know why he did it. And he's sort of pleading with him to tell him. And you can tell that Macroon wants to tell him as well.
I knew I'd get you sooner or later.
How long have you been out?
A year.
And you waited a whole year before you came looking for me.
I told you, Sergeant.
Someone gave you the gun and the car and told you where to find it. Who was it?
Why don't you make your peace with God?
And just at the moment where you think you're going to get the revelation of what's behind all this. And the cliche is, of course, it's not the bang from the shotgun. It's police marksman shoots Macroon in the head. And then it's immediately followed by the one moment where Craven finally breaks down. After 4 episodes of holding it all in, he finally cries. And it's so desperately sad. I just love that moment.
One of the weirder things is that Sean Caffrey, who played Macroon, actually had previously played Lord Palmerdale in Doctor Who Horror of Fang Rock.
I would never have guessed that in a million years.
It took me years to sort of kind of link the two together, and it's just quite shocking, really, when you get it. But there you are.
One thing we should mention is the American remake. And there's a 2010 film. Now, ordinarily I wouldn't spend much time on this, but what is interesting about it is that it's directed by Martin Campbell and produced by Michael Waring. So 2 of the key players have got their fingerprints all over it. Have you seen the film, John? It's terrible.
I have seen it. I saw it once quite some time ago, and yes, it is terrible.
It's worse than I remembered. I watched it last night again, and it just made me angry and bewildered. I mean, what's incredible about it is that Emma doesn't go into the nuclear reactor. They poison her with milk. Craven doesn't go to the nuclear reactor. They poison him as well. And the Jedburgh character, played by Ray Winston, it just has a terminal illness. It's just insane. And all the nuance and all the interesting things about Edge of Darkness is just stripped away. What were they thinking? How did that get made?
Well, my understanding, and I don't absolutely know this for definite, but apparently Mel Gibson, who plays Craven in the film, was a huge fan of 80s British TV drama, UK TV drama generally. And I think there's certainly some credence in this, because basically he loved Edge of Darkness and I think wanted Martin Campbell to direct it. Mm-hmm. He also, I think, was one of the driving forces behind The Singing Detective being made into a film.
The Robert Downey Jr. version.
Yeah, Robert Downey Jr. is in that. And it's interesting because Robert Downey Jr. was just coming off one of his really bad patches with drugs. And he was basically told, you've got one last chance. I think Mel Gibson put up some of the money because they couldn't insure Robert Downey Jr. And he plays the main character, the Philip Marlowe character in The Singing Detective. And Mel Gibson plays a psychiatrist in it in a bald wig. A very bad bald wig as well. And it seems that we owe both of those series being made into films to the driving force of Mel Gibson. Now, I have to say The Singing Detective it's not The Singing Detective, but it's okay, I would say. Yeah. Potter's family liked it and they were consulted on it. And Robert Downey Jr. is fine in it. It's all a bit too compressed, but then, that's what you're going to get. But with Edge of Darkness, and I suppose Michael Waring and Martin Campbell being involved, maybe it's this feeling that if someone's going to take something that I really love and made and crafted, I'd rather it was me that fucked it up than some stranger coming along to do it. That's the only kind of rationalisation.
So what happened to Troy Kennedy Martin after Edge of Darkness?
It's interesting, after such a success, I think he became such a person of such influence, and he already was to an extent. I think everybody expected a lot more to come from him, but it didn't really. There were a couple of films. There was an adaptation of all things, Bravo 20, the Andy McNabb book. There were sort of two things between 1985 Edge of Darkness and Bravo 20 1999. It was a bit of a damp squib in a way, but he did write a couple of film scripts, and one of them was Ferrari, which for many years was a Michael Mann project, and Michael Mann was basically waiting for the right amount of money because he thought it was going to be phenomenally expensive to do. And absolutely out of nowhere, because I'd not been keeping up with it, I suddenly saw a thing saying, oh, Troy Kennedy Martin's got a new film out. It was like, what? And basically, I think Michael Mann said at one point the only thing that kept him going over all the years was how much he loved Troy Kennedy Martin's script. And that in the end, I think there's one other writer credited, but Troy Kennedy Martin is front and centre. He's a kind of top billed writer for it, rather than what you might expect would be a whole host of names. Proper big budget Hollywood film, so I'm sure he would have been pleased by that. It's odd to sort of almost have a script preserved in aspic for so many years, but it got made, and I think there's one more that's waiting.
So, John, before we go, we did ask some people for their thoughts on Edge of Darkness, and we did get quite a few replies, all of them positive, I've got to say. What have you got, John?
I've got one from Carl Jefferson, who calls it the best TV drama ever done, and I just wish I could have been there for the pitch meeting, if that's what it's called. It went on for months, I think, the pitch meeting.
Russell Parker says, a rare example of perfect television. Each episode is genuinely better than the last. Absolutely everyone involved is right at the top of their game. Endlessly rewatchable. No argument from me.
No, I've got Mike Nell, who said, there is so much that is memorable about Edge, but the most important is one of the all-time great casts, leaning not on name recognition, but on sheer acting brilliance.
Chris Orton praises the series, but he did add, the bit with the dildo was a touch too far, and probably would have had Mary Whitehouse choking on her cornflakes.
Well, if she's eating cornflakes at that time of night, she deserves it. We've got the mighty Steve Roberts.
Why isn't he fixing Moonbase 3?
Yeah, exactly. Get the aspect ratio sorted out, Steve. Get the Blu-ray out there. Steve Roberts said that it proves that portals are possible Because when Craven and his gang raid the Systime Computers building in Leeds, and then they run through the building and exit into the Barbican in London.
What a pedant.
Exactly.
Just before we go, John, I just want to point out again that how impressed I am by the HD remaster of Edge of Darkness. In my experience of watching the programme on VHS and even on DVD, it's always looked a bit rubbish. But finally, it looks fantastic. So whoever did the remastering on that, thank you so much. It looks brilliant.
No, I totally agree. I bought virtually every kind of thing. I bought the VHS and everything looked muddy. I thought the DVD didn't look particularly great. No, it's nice to see it properly for the first time. And in typical fashion, I bought the Blu-ray and then I've only just now, for this, watched it. As is the way with many of my Blu-rays.
Okay, John, I think that's Edge of Darkness ticked off our list, our very long list.
It's looking a bit daunting, isn't it? But we'll persevere.
If you like this podcast, please like and subscribe, and join us again in 2 weeks' time when John and I take another trip through the TV archives. Until then, I've been Neil.
And I've been John.
And you've been listening to The World of Telly.